All right. Splendid greetings, kindly students. It has been so long since we have had a video. And computer Mr. Shea was speaking. But the time has come to return. And we return with the growth of the Republic. And this is George Washington. Good guy. And as you may or may not know, George Washington, as this country begins anew with the new Constitution, which has now set up the government in a way acceptable to most people. George Washington, he is elected as president. Now, interesting enough, there was some debate over what the president should be called, who this leader should be called. Some people were considering His Majesty. So how would people refer to the man or woman? And pretty much they settled on Mr. President, which is still in effect today. George Washington wins every single electoral vote. So he is the only and remains only unanimous selection for president. And he wasn't particularly eager to become president. He was pretty okay with leading troops in the revolution, but he wasn't that excited to lead the country, namely because the country had a lot of problems that he was presented with, and he had to leave home, which he had a lovely house in Virginia, so now he has to move. But George Washington is the first president of the United States, and this is one of George Washington's sets of teeth. Notorious for the fact he had very bad teeth. So to make up for the fact that much of his teeth had fallen out or rotted away, dentists made fake teeth for him. They carved it out of ivory, so mostly whale ivory. But this ivory was then held together with large pieces of metal. If you look at the metal on those teeth, it would be incredibly uncomfortable to have that in your mouth, which is why George Washington's face was often swollen and he did not smile much, because I can imagine the pain and agony such a feat would include. Understanding some other problems that George Washington was faced was that initially there's a lot of disunity. There's this large piece of land. The population in 1789, which when he becomes president, is a little under 4 million people. They're divided by climate. They're divided by geography. We have the northern New England states with a very different nature than the southern states. There's vast differences between rich and poor. Lest we forget, we have slaves as well. And even within cities, we have a lot of contrast between types of people. Politically, there's also a lot of differences. You have various factions that don't support the Constitution. Rhode Island doesn't even trust this Constitution. They don't even send people to the Constitutional Convention. Some people are trying to keep their states out of it. There's people that are resenting what the government has done. So there's a whole lot of problems. Some people think that George Washington's going to become a king and we're going to be just as bad as England. Namely, Sam Adams and John Hancock both thought that. They thought we were going to get a king. And with all this distrust of politicians, with all of this distrust of the government, that is what George Washington comes into. So he rolls into New York City, which at this point is now the capital, temporary capital at least. And his goal is to now make the country better. So here's good old New York. And one of the big problems is the economy. Economy is in shambles. Since England was the number one trade partner with the United States before the Revolution, or at least with the colonies, well, now England's not particularly happy. They've lost a war. So the trade has been very much decimated. You have all these ships here, as you can see on New York Harbor. a lot of ships are just sitting there because there's no one to trade with. So all these sailors have nothing to do. You have various other problems, which include England refusing to leave forts that were established in the Ohio Valley. You have England refusing to follow various treaties that they had signed. They're playing certainly a grumpy loser, but also the English were demanding that property be returned to people, and since there was no functioning government in the United States, that didn't happen. Some other problems that we have. New Orleans. New Orleans was in control by the Spanish, and since it's at the mouth of the Mississippi River, the Spanish are shutting down trade to the Americans, so now all of these goods, which would normally flow down the Mississippi River, cannot. So there's a lot of economic problems that we have that's going on. So what Washington does is he takes office, and he decides to hire or put into his cabinet, which are his closest advisors, a few people that are going to help make this country better. So first guy we have is Henry Knox. He is Secretary of War, so he is hopefully going to be doing some work to keep the United States out of war, but in fact, if they do go in war, he'll be in charge. We also have good old Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton is Secretary of the Treasury. So his job is especially to take care of the economy, to make some plans to fix this economically poor country. And then we have Thomas Jefferson, who is the Secretary of State. So especially when it comes to making treaties with other countries, he is going to be the man in charge. These last two guys, Hamilton and Jefferson, they, a good word would be hate each other. They both have very differing ideas of how the country should be run, and especially how the country should get out of all of the debt and financial troubles that it is in. So, what are the issues that are at play that these men, namely those four men, George Washington, Henry Knox, Alexander Hamilton, and Thomas Jefferson, must solve? First, they need to establish credit and currency. So this, after the Constitution, the United States central government is now in charge of making currency. States are not making their own currency, so first they have to figure out how to do this. The problem with currency is you can't just print money. It becomes worthless. People have to trust the money that they are using, especially trusting that paper money. And they need credit. They want to make sure that people will lend money to the United States. The United States at this point, after the Revolutionary War, has approximately, in today's money, $8 trillion in debt. $8 trillion in debt that they have yet to pay back. So there is a ton of money that has been loaned out, and there's now a question of what should we do with that to establish credit. Also, there needs to be determined is this relationship between the state governments and the central government. While all these powers have been put out into place in the Constitution, how will that come into play? What really should be done? What should the federal government do, and what should the states be also in charge of? We also now have many laws, so the fight now becomes, when should we enforce laws and when should we not? Because enforcing the laws might intrude on someone's liberty. It might go against the Bill of Rights. So where should the government act and where shouldn't they? And finally, we have foreign relations. England is quite grumpy, and France is about to have a revolution of their own. We have these pesky Spanish down in New Orleans. So how are we going to deal, as the United States, going to deal with other countries in the world? So these are the four big topics we're going to be covering the next week and a half or so. And how they play out really helps shape the United States for the next few hundred years.